first point he makes is that human beings are very odd creatures. Most animals are either social or solitary. We are social solitary. We are social in very fundamental ways, and we are solitary in very fundamental ways. And both of these are crucial part of who we are. We can't really understand human beings without that. So what does he mean by the fact that we are social? And what does he mean by when he says that we are solitary? And what does he mean that we are social solitary? We are social in the sense that we work together. I'm speaking right now, the words that I'm using have been developed by so many people over such a long period of time. And I'm leveraging all of that. We are using Zoom, which has been created by quite a few people. The internet, the system that we have we owe so much to, I'm sitting here in New York in peace. There are laws that I'm counting on. There is prosperity that we have this leisure time to be able to talk about it. Most of it, not most of it, almost all of it has been created by somebody else, which I'm leveraging, which I'm riding on the top of. You can never forget that. So we are deeply, deeply social creatures. At the same time, the way we move forward is by individuals having initiatives, independently thinking, independently putting something together on our own, many times contrary to everything else that other people have done in order to move forward. So both those things are a crucial part of who we are. That's the first point. If you would like to comment about it, if you have questions about it, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. So this is the point about us being social solitary. So anybody wants to say anything on it, go right ahead. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. All right. The next big topic, and this is actually, if you look at the summary, I'm actually using the summary in the chat itself, which I would recommend you do too. There is a question of plasticity, the nature of the brain of a baby, and investment made in the child by evolution. So those 3 points, okay? The thing that really sets human beings apart is our plasticity, our ability to change, our ability to transform ourselves. And this is seen, and this is seen in the title here of this episode, The Long Childhood. If you look at a snake, baby snake, when it is born, it is identical to its parents, and it has the same capability of its parents. This is not true for human beings. This is not true for mammals. And as mammals evolve, the more plastic the mammal, longer the childhood. So we are born with only, like, if you look at the proportion, he talks about the proportion. So if you look at the size of my brain, it's about 3 pounds. Okay. I weigh about 150 pounds. So it's 5 times or 50 times the body weight. The body weighs 50 times more. But when you're born, the body is mere appendage to the brain. Okay. And that brain too is only half formed. Rest of the brain forms in interaction with the world and in interaction with society. So basically the brain connections are made in interaction with the environment and with culture. That is a huge, huge point. It's a tremendous cost. These children are completely dependent on their parents till 18, some would say more. But for a long time, they are not able to feed themselves. They are not, it's an immense resource sink. The payoff is the capability that we have of adjusting to our surroundings, adapting to our surroundings. A child born today, the environment in which it grows up, the way it interacts with people is different for a child born 2000 years ago, or even 20 years ago. It masters everything that the culture has produced at this time. That's a huge thing. So those three things, so investment, plasticity, and the nature of the brain of the baby. So this, all of it, the core point is that of plasticity, and it is biological. It is biological, okay? So go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to talk about plasticity. So we will go ahead, we'll have chance to talk about each of these points as they are made, especially if you have watched the video. If you'd like to add your comment about anything, just go ahead and do that, because I want to build a large discussion. And at the end, we will pull together all the themes that we put down. So go ahead and type exclamation mark. Dave, what do you think about plasticity? And followed by Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. I think this falls into that category, but on his mantle was a figurine of a man on a horse. And he made the comment that the man has learned to ride the horse, but the horse does not ride the man. And that this is a fairly recent discovery of apparently the last 5,000 years, that man can learn and change. Thank you.
Wonderful, excellent point. So horse and the rider is a great example of that. So fantastic. Next up is Joe.
I'm a little bit worried that I may be jumping.
Go ahead.
Ahead. Okay, all right, because I don't want to jump ahead, but I thought what really pulled it all together for me was the von Neumann example of what he would have been in the 1800s versus what he would have, like if he had been in a traditional structure, in that social structure. He would have been studying, rabbinical. He would be in rabbinical studies. He would not be a mathematician. He would not have, expanded the way he had expanded. And I think that speaks to the social element changing. And a lot of it also comes back to the changing of the written word itself. That's another important part in this process, is that it expanded the intellect as well, and it started to actually, expanded our brains, our minds, and it allowed us to make connections that we were never otherwise have been able to make. So this is the connection between the social structure that von Neumann would have been in and the actual tools, the democratic information democracy, as he looked at, and how these two had come together, and how that actually is impacted by our ability for our brain to learn and grow, and the neuroplasticity of the brain. They're all interrelated to one another. I think I probably will stop right there, but there's a lot more that I can say to the written word.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So let me make that point, because that's something that Bronowski doesn't make as explicitly.
Right.
But people like, for example, Merlin Donald or Marshall McLuhan, that is their main point. But what happens is that what us humans do is that we create external culture. It's, Merlin Donald calls it external memory. which actually shapes you. And so writing is a classic example of that. You write, and you can look at all of civilization as that, as external memory, whether it is the road that you build, the house that you are living in. It's all externalizing things so that you can move to the next level. And now when you look at it from the perspective of a child, the child is taking in all the technology, and the technology is kind of shaping what the child can do. And then the child uses all of that to develop the technology further. So there is this loop going on between the human and the environment, the human externalizing whatever products of the mind, and then using that as an input to shape how people think, especially children. Children, like you look at a child look at a 5-year-old with a smartphone, okay, and just look at them, how they handle it. And they are magnificent, okay? I mean, I am put to shame when I see them use their iPhone, okay? Because they grow up with it, they learn so much of how to use it, and then they go to the next level based on that. So this external culture, and the reason we do that, reason that a 5-year-old is better than me at using iPhone, is the point about long childhood. Same thing with language. You pick that up when you are growing up, the language itself, and you go to a new level. So that's a huge point. Next up is Marisa.
I want to share a quote or two for it that I feel are like just beautiful ways of presenting what you've just said for those who didn't get a chance to watch the video. And the video opens up with a very simple statement that I think it's kind of beautiful how it just explains what you've just been saying. He says it in one sentence. He says, "Man is unique, not because he does science, and he is unique not because he does art, but because science and art equally are expressions of his marvelous plasticity of mind." And I love that. I love the fact that he points out a very basic way to show how we are so plastic, and that's by science and art, and putting them on the same level, which I think is brilliant.
Wonderful, wonderful. And this is a theme that is there throughout. So science, you're kind of trying to take in things and trying to organize it, mostly about the world. And art, you are expressing it. So it's like it's in different directions. So it's like science is kind of taking in and art is putting out, and both of them kind of work together. And you see it in people like Leonardo, where their art is enhanced by science, their science is enhanced by art in this loop. Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Judith.
Yeah, so what I found really powerful too, one thing that I found really powerful was, that the science and the art, that's our culture, right? But he said that if man were to look back at this ancient ancestor millions of years ago, that first started walking upright, that changed everything, we wouldn't, we would recognize them maybe, but they wouldn't recognize us. Whereas a gazelle or one of those animals that they hunted has hardly changed in all those millions of years. So it just shows the power of that plasticity, and that, using art and science to take these huge steps forward every generation to generation, to really build an amazing creature.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, just really quickly, this is kind of almost directly relates to Marshall McLuhan as well. You know, we shape our tools and our tools shape us. So when we're talking about this idea, again, I think you're right, he understates it, but he talked about how, you know, I forget, it was Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, and a couple of other people that were defenders of the intellect. What they were actually protecting was the ability to learn knowledge, information itself, and that was to us. That was critical to our own evolution, and that's what they were actually protecting, is our own personal. It's our ability to evolve. But I do see a lot of the Marshall McLuhan's types of theories exactly playing out into what he was speaking about.
Thank you. Next point, we're going to look at the hand. Okay. I mean, I love the way in which he proceeds. Like he talks about the hand and this particular gesture. Dave, go ahead.
Yes, the opposable thumb is a key to our development. And I like, he said simply that, you know, our hand is out here exploring, giving information back to the brain, and the brain is directing the hand. So it's actually a two-directional thing. And a lot of this was about the brain. So, and I also will bring in vision as well as the language, because he was talking about, of course, the prefrontal cortex, we all know, is decision area. You see on the side is, they were just discovering 50 years ago that where it converts your vision from two-dimensional to three-dimensional. And of course, in previous meetups, we learned that half of our brain is just processing our vision. And you know, it's all automatic. We don't even think about this stuff. But the interesting thing was, on the opposite side of the brain is the processing of speech and language. So he was saying, you know, this interpretation of our vision, it's almost questioning our origin of our language or our speech, how much internal processing. I know I've heard people say that they dream in words, and you know, I dream in images, but I also think whenever I make a decision, you know, I'm going to have some pizza, I say that to myself. I may not say it out loud, but I think in words. And with the humanoid, or whatever they say, is our internal self, I wonder if it actually dwells in that area. But thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, so let's look at this, the hand. Okay, again, this is, this is great opportunity because I'm able to pull in as I'm doing, and I'm doing this on the fly. Many things that I've studied since I read, you know, watched this video and read this book, you know, 25 years ago. The critical thing here is the upright posture. Okay, the upright posture is a critical, he doesn't make this point, but it's a huge point. Imagine a creature on all fours, our ancestor, in a grassland. That's where we were. The grass actually completely covers your eyes here. Okay, you are not able to see. You might, temporarily, you may be able to peek over it by standing temporarily on your two legs. Now, see what the upright posture does. Okay, upright posture does two things. Firstly, it vastly expands the visual that you get of your environment dramatically. Secondly, it frees up the hands. Okay, hands were used on all fours. And so it does both these things together. So the brain, the size of the brain grows dramatically once you have the upright posture, because it is doing two things. It is taking vastly large amount of input, and it is able to output using these hands. It is able to manipulate our world dramatically. So it raises, and that is what, you know, there is a tremendous explosion of the size of the brain that happens at the same time. Now, the ability to manipulate, like our primate ancestors have ability to grasp like this with the hand. Okay, what we have are these opposable thumbs, which gives a precision grasp and be able to manipulate things in detail. Okay, plus with being able to see things at a distance, and with the hand, you're able to throw things. You are able to look at things, some like a gazelle at a distance, and you're able to throw. And you are able to see other people, and you're able to coordinate between them in order to chase the gazelle. Okay, so suddenly there is an explosion of range of what you can do that happens, and all of it happens together. And hand is a crucial part of this system. Next up is Alice.
What I was going to mention was the first time I watched the whole series Ascent of Man when I was 12 or something, I missed what I picked up watching the video this time was as soon as Bronowski did this, I recognized, oh, it's John Mudra. Look at the energy and the power that this gesture holds. And he didn't mention it, but now with the knowledge and evolution that I have gained, that was the first thing I thought of.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. So hand is the first thing in this sequence. The second thing that he talks about is speech. Okay, speech is a crucial part. So hand is one crucial human thing. The second one is speech. There are animals who can make sounds, but being able to denote things, being able to communicate with each other, it allows for things which are it allows for cooperation far more complex than is possible. Now, what we are discovering is that animals themselves are much greater than what we thought. So for example, chimpanzees are able to coordinate hunts. We did not think that it was possible, but they actually saw chimpanzees actually hunting down other monkeys fairly effectively. But what human beings do is at a completely different level. Now, again, on language, there is a lot more that has happened since Bronowski, and that I have learned with people like Julian Jaynes, what language can do. People like Walter Ong of transition between orality and literacy, what that happens. So moment the language becomes written, it becomes something else, something much, 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 much higher than purely oral language. And all of that is human. Many times when people think about language, we don't have a good grasp of what actual oral language looks like, because we are, the written culture is such a big part of us that even the way we speak now is shaped by writing, and the fact that we read and write. So it is complete, but that ability of being able to understand things, name things, store knowledge, communicate, write it down, transmit it across generations, across people, is something that characterizes human beings. Madeline.
As far as language goes, that was a good point that other animals do communicate verbally. They do it through gestures, mimetically. I think the real difference is that we use symbols. We communicate symbolically. And as far as we know, no other animals are doing that. And that really seems to be the only difference. Everything else is a difference in degree. It's a quantitative difference, but there seems to be a real qualitative difference, which is that we use symbols. And a symbol can be anything. We tend to think of visual, but it can be a metaphor. It could be a sound that represents something else entirely, that's not mimetic. So I would say the use of symbols is probably the most telling aspect of human language, whether it's oral or written.
Yes, I mean, there is a point about quality, but quantity is also important, and it has profound impact on how these things work. So for example, with the advent of writing and other external memories like cities and laws, many, we can have 1 million people working together on these things. And what that generates is something truly spectacular. So it is the combination of the qualitative and quantitative is made possible through these things, like the writing is crucial. We can formulate laws, we can formulate ways of interacting with each other that makes a scale of cooperation possible, which is not really possible with other animals. So it's the difference is stunning. It is staggering. Bob.
Hi. As I indicated in the chat, speech, language, words, they go back and forth in the brain, and so they indicate memory. And once you have memory, once you can communicate memory, you can talk about what happened in the past, what is promising for the future, and this is a terrific tool for that humans can use that other animals seem to lack.
Absolutely. And the core point of Merlin Donald is that really the thing that scales up is external memory. So we not only have our own memory, but we, by putting it outside in things like books, we are able to scale up, not just within our own, our own efficiency, but across people, across generations, across cultures, which really scales things up. Vanessa.
Well, for lack of a better word, there may be a primitive way to communicate. Like you can probably tell if an animal's angry, if it's like a cat hissing or something. And humans, sometimes with the oral language, you can also read more into like the gestures of the facial person or the tone, like the satire. Like if I would say, really, that you can say really maybe 5, 6, 7 different ways. You realize, okay, it's completely different versus in the animal. There's probably just one way to say it, and they don't really have the satire of the human. Maybe they have the ability to, laugh and chuckle, but.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Good point. I mean, what happens is that the oral language, like in the oral communication, most of the communication is through gestures, through body language. A lot of it is through tones, and only little of it is the conceptual content. Typically, oral language, in a typical oral culture, this is a group of people who have lived with each other for all their lives, 30 people who know each other since birth. So there is a lot of context that is taken for granted. And all of this is real. And in terms of the body language and in tone, we do share that with other animals, but that is a small component. What we share, I mean, the point that Bronowski is making is that there is something that human beings have, which is different from animals. There is a lot of things that we have common with animals, but there is something that is more. And that is what is responsible for ascent of man. And that is what he's focusing on throughout. Joe.
Yeah, another important point out of this as well is when you have written language and you have ways of communication, is that you're able to have patterns, established patterns as well. And these patterns allow you to set up societies in a sense that you can set up rules because you have a set of patterns that make sense to govern a society as a whole. So then you start to have this way of, and this is what I think that he's talking about, where you get to the ethical concerns, the integrity and ethical concerns that are associated with developing a culture and developing a language and developing a way of functioning, so that's how a society then moves forward, is through essentially you're setting your society up so that it can be structured. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you. So the context we're looking at is the ascent of man. That's the overall theme. So what we're trying to do is that we're trying to say, what is it that is unique to human beings? So this is the first section. And then second section, we're going to look at all the implications of that. Madeline.
I would just like to add to Joe's point, and also what you were saying about oral cultures, that you would probably live your whole life in a small group of people. And so these are very networked societies. Justice is very dependent upon who's in charge, who's the head of the pack, all of that. And it's really building on what Joe was saying, it's the advent of writing that allowed us to have external laws that could be applied even-handedly across the spectrum of people. Whether or not that actually happens, that can be the ideal, because now there's something external to refer to that's not a constant, ongoing, subjective thing of relationships.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Maritza.
I just wanted to also add on there. I don't know where you would put in the line of the items you were just mentioning, where you would put imagination, but Bronowski does.
Coming up. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, am I jumping ahead? I'm
No,
sorry.
No. Go ahead. I'm coming to that. Go ahead. But
He, I like that he mentions that, when we're looking at what it is that sets us above the animals, and what triggered it was you were just saying, Shrikant, there are all these things that we have in common with animals. And then what is it that makes us other? And he says that it becomes plain that imagination is a specifically human trait or gift, because he says to imagine is the characteristic act, not of the poet's mind or the painter's or the scientist, but of the mind of man. And again, I just really like the way he strings that together.
wonderful. I like to do syntopical things. So I was watching today a video by Jordan Peterson, and just like I am jumping ahead and watching the final one in this series first, I did the same thing with the Bible series, and it is by far the best video in the series, I think, because I think that's the best video I've seen of Jordan Peterson. That's on resurrection on Jesus and what that means. And the point there is actually the same point that Bronowski is making. So I will do some parallels between that and this. So basically what you're saying, what he's saying is that that's the next step. The issue of foresight. All animals are kind of here and now. Whatever seems to be kind of a long range thing, it's just kind of built in. But human beings are able to project. Human beings, using Janesian terms of, you have this mental space where you can play out, what would happen if I did this? What happened if I took that course? And you're able to reason about it. So that ability of having foresight, of planning, is the hallmark of human. The way in which Jordan Peterson puts it, it's about not just consuming everything right now. It is saying that, yes, I've killed a mammoth. There is a limit to how much I can eat. Okay, I can save something for tomorrow. So that means there is a concept of, okay, I'm going to be hungry tomorrow too. Then you add to it the saying that no matter how, this is going to get spoiled if I keep, no matter, even if I try to eat as much as I can every day, it's going to get spoiled. If I give this to other people that I care about, then maybe when they get a mammoth, they will give me something. So it is a way, and you're building relationships, you're trading, but it is all about not, instead of being focused on just here and now, you're focused here and now and yourself. You are focused on larger scale of time, larger space, and other people as a part of your context. And you're calculating things based on that. That is foresight. This is all from Jordan Peterson, but it's the same point. Actually, I thought that was a really brilliant way of putting it. Mammoth is a classic way of capturing, what this sequence looks like. So it's going to be Joe followed by Alice.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far off. I mean, but I guess it does relate to the importance of imagination too, is the power of myth within that context as well. So then what happens out of that is, once you have written word and once you have myth, you can also have ritual. And that's where he was going through with the rituals that are in Easter Ireland, which, has its own limitations with it. But those are, once you have the ability to write, once you have the ability to communicate or imagine different things differently, you can start to try and explain the unknown. And when you're explaining the unknown, then you can kind of come up with hypotheses that then later get disproven, but it's still part of our us progressing as people.
Yeah, excellent point. And relating to point Maritza was making about imagination also, future does not exist. It is imagined.
Right.
It is, you have to project it. It is an act of imagination to say that this will happen, because it is not now. Imagination is, tied. The idea of time as a variable, of saying that there is future and past, because otherwise there is only present. So you don't really have a concept of time. So concept of time itself is a conceptual achievement. It's very closely tied to concepts. And the way in which Jordan Peterson puts it is that you're basically saying not only kind of future things. Okay, there is a hierarchy, just like the mammoth went from, it's like eat today and eat tomorrow, and then eat cooperatively with other people so it'll be more effective. The next step is that you yourself become a variable. An animal just has I, here, now. Human beings can have a concept of a future self, your ideal self. What should I be? What should I be to be effective? That also is an act of imagination. That also is an act of thinking about the future instead of the present. Next up is Alice.
Okay, what you were just saying, Shrikant, had me running down new rabbit holes, but it speaks, I think, to the social solitary dynamic as well, and the development, not only to take care of yourself, but the interactivity, the building of social capital, evolving into society and civilization, and things that others before me have mentioned. So yeah, it's recursive. We're going around again and touching on the same topics. What I initially was thinking about, and I think Joseph, you said when you have written language, then you can develop patterns. And I think I would say that even just orality, the storytelling of language can inspire patterns, and talking about myth and the development of imagination, and then using, gosh, was it Madeline, I think, said, something that I now forget. But it's the sense making, the meaning making that I think humans have as distinct from animals, is that we want to know our role, and we want to have understanding and have some sort of meaning.
Yeah.
Speaking in gross generalizations. But I think this all contributes to the curiosity, the imagination, which then drives us to innovate and develop technologies and spurs us forward.
Excellent. So I'll say a couple of things. One is that myths and stories that you're talking about are critical. Those were actually the first ways of dealing with future. You are trying to kind of project what would happen, what would you look like, what would be the consequence of it. And initially we grappled with it as stories instead of making statements, because there is actions. Like this is again a point from Jordan Peterson. This is actually Piaget's point, that initially you do actions, then you kind of see the patterns of actions, and only later then you can kind of actually name it in words, and then you have the ability of manipulating them. So there is this kind of bottom up building, and stories or myths or religions, they were the first ways in which we grappled with the future. And that's again a strength that Jordan Peterson has, because he's able to understand religion at a very deep level, more so than Bronowski. Bronowski is coming from the science perspective, science angle, but I think Jordan Peterson understands religion, and he can see that the same thing is going on in using different means of a story rather than a formula projecting what will happen in the future. Next up is Maritza, followed by Vanessa. Maritza.
What Alice was saying and what you just expounded upon is, it makes me think of the fact that humans are avid and very vivid scenario builders, and that's kind of what part of what sets them apart aspect, showing that, you know, it's still, again, I know that it was mentioned in the comments that, you know, some animals have been shown to be able to build some, you know, scenarios of future, but it's not, the difference is the, you know, we do it, it's the way in which we do it and the way in which we share, because again, it goes back to the very first concept you mentioned of the social solitary, is that while we do the scenario building in our heads, we have this like almost innate desire to share it with others. And so it's just what I wanted to add, that it's imagination, not just like I have an imaginary friend, but we use imagination when we're talking the sciences, the mathematics, there's an element and a thread of imagination that's feeding all of those things that we do as humans.
Wonderful, thank you. So Vanessa, what do you think about planning in human beings?
Oh, well, I guess this may draw to it. I was actually going to say, I think the man's greatest gift to himself was written language. Because if you think of a computer, it's like, how much more memory did we free up? It's like we've got maybe 70 external hard drives we can fall back on and open the brain up for that much more. And then even to the planning, if you need to, you can fall back and look at the hard drive, or pick up an encyclopedia, so you don't have to store that in your brain. And then also developing, you know, the sense of value being like numbers. You know, you give a definitive value versus saying a couple, a few, a handful. And let's see, I've had to think about the and also with the even with planning when you're trying to form a kid's mind, you know, when they're sometimes the best way to teach them is through stories. Or, you know, you maybe even like, you know, if you're playing with blocks or something versus telling them the fact, if you kind of illustrate it either by playing with models or whatever, or toy figurines, or like the fables. So like I think sometimes we learn more indirectly because it involves maybe the imagination and even planning how you're going to tell the story, or planning how you're going to express your thoughts here, so you don't seem like a computer that's offline and running on Apple when you got a PC.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, so the next point is going to be about, so there's one more point I want to make before we go to the next section, and that is the concept of preparation. Okay, you can look at the long childhood as preparation. So we need to prepare because we have culture. So it's like culture is like accumulation of all the work that everybody has done. And given that, we have to prepare. We have to build our skills. And that's a crucial part of human, human experience, that we need preparation. It's not that you can just quickly do anything, because there is a lot to learn. You need to take that in and do that. Dave.
Yeah, I liked his notation that unless a child plays with blocks, he will never become an architect and build a building. It also brings to mind that the little girls playing mom, they're not imitating mom, but they have this structure in their mind about what a mom does. So when they do tea or whatever, they're playing their mom, and that they're preparing to become an adult. Yeah.
Beautiful. Excellent point. And again, it's really uncanny how parallel this video that I watched today of Jordan Peterson is to this one. You know, Piaget is actually the most brilliant thinker on this issue, that kids start by imitating what parents are. And that's the starting point. They really, if you ask them at that point, what are you doing? They won't be able to tell you. They're just imitating it. It's mimetic. Okay. Slowly they are able to actually kind of name it. And then later on, they are able to kind of do it in an explicit way. So it is kind of, action is the base. And then there is work that takes place, kind of inducing things from it and naming things, and then being able to manipulate that. Next up is going to be Jyoti, followed by Joe. Jyoti.
Yeah, I had read a study which indicated that children, the human beings are the only ones who don't have a longer childhood. As a result, the grandparents are not able to spend a lot of time teaching them about what happened in the past and how the heritage and the culture flew. So since they don't have that kind of experience with the grandparents, they, like you said, Shrikant, about the preparation for the culture, does not take place as much as it could take place. So there is a pitfall in not having a long child.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, Bronowski is talking mostly at a biological level, of saying that, the brain fully develops over a period of time. But it is clearly, I mean, it's a very interesting point. I mean, what is that childhood used for? So for example, one of the critical things is that in our evolutionary heritage, it was the extended family that surrounded the child. And that's a very powerful thing, because you have got not only your parents, but your grandparents, you have your siblings, you have your cousins, you have your uncles, and you're actually learning from all of them. And that is the context in which kind of the learning takes place. In terms of your point about grandkids, grandparents, and versus kind of nuclear family. It's a good point. That's a good point. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I just want to come back to Dave's point really briefly, because it's an important one of the idea of role playing within the context of, it's not only just the role playing of, the mother and child in that sense, but it also gets into the idea of what we talked about quite a bit on Thursday, was the theory of games and von Neumann's theories within that. So he showed the book. He said, this is just, it's all mathematical equations, but it's much more than that. I mean, it's depicting how we interact with one another and when people will do something. And that's really important as far as how we function as a society as well. Yeah. And how we set ourselves up as a society. So that's where the advent of game theory, which is incredibly complex, is based off of role playing, and even goes into something as little as bluffing, and has a really interesting example with that. So that's an important.
Excellent. And Peterson does a very good job on this one. He says, because friendships are really based on trade, and kind of human relationships are based on trade. So as you develop, as you start trading, you may not even, if you see that happening in children, that they learn to play together, and playing involves a trade. It's, you are getting something and they are getting something. And children can tell when things are fair and not fair, even at that level. And then slowly over time, you learn to play in a way where you're fair. Then you develop a reputation for being fair. And then people want to play with you more. So it's through those actions of justice that you develop a concept of justice, and and it happens very early, initially through observation of actions and consequences, and then slowly kind of getting the concepts for it.
And then there's the idea of Nash's cooperative games that can be evolved after that as well, so games of cooperation. And what's the equilibrium then for us when we're getting essentially for that it's the best advantage for all of us.
Right. So and the other hierarchy is basically the kind of, for example, Jordan Peterson was talking about reputation. So it's like you develop a reputation for being somebody who is trustworthy,
right,
who is honest, and who is fair. And that allows you to actually trade a lot more because the reputation precedes you. So it opens up many things. So you have this kind of hierarchy of actually playing, then naming it, and then getting a social reputation. And all of it keeps increasing your ability to live. Excellent. Now let's go to the second part. Let me go ahead and post the second part again in the chat. So let me go ahead and do that. So we are now going to be talking about the implications of human nature. So for those people who just came in, I want to summarize. This is the part B that we are going to be talking about, but I'm going to put in the part A that we just finished talking about. I'm going to summarize it very quickly for you. Basically talked about human beings as a social solitary, both social and solitary. Plasticity as being the heart of human being, which can be seen in the brain of a child, which is formed, only half formed, rest of it forms in interaction with the environment and the culture and people. We talked about the very large investment that evolution puts in a child. We talked about the use of hand. We talked about speech. We talked about foresight and planning. We talked about the concept of preparation and being, the willingness to project things into the future and wait for results as being the hallmark of what is human. Now, we are going to be talking about the implications of this nature. Now, this is, Bronowski is brilliant because he takes these points, he actually identifies these kind of crucial concretes which illuminate a topic. One of my favorite things in this was his discovery of genes by Mendel. And he asks a very simple question, because for a long time, people used to, this is a slight digression, but this is just a tribute to how well Bronowski uses concretes to illustrate concepts. So he says that for a long time, everybody thought that when two genes combine, the result is somewhere in the middle, which is like the commonsensical thing. But he says Mendel was the one who discovered that when you combine the two genes, it's either this or that, okay? And he was saying, I want to guess why that was the case. Why did this thing, why did he discover it? He says, it's probably because he was a monk. Because there is one very large piece of data that is available to everybody, that is just staring everybody in the face. And that is men and women get together and they produce children. And they are either men or women, not somewhere in between. So the idea of either or is there. So why is it? He says only a monk could notice that, oh, it's only men and women that are produced. So it must be either this or that. And maybe all genes are like that. Okay. He does the same thing over here. Us in the West actually revere the child. Okay, hold child as a value. That is not the case in all cultures. Traditional cultures generally hold the adult as the ideal, and they drill that ideal in a child. So the entire mindset is that the role of the child is to grow up to be an adult just like his dad. And that's it. And that's the end. There are no other questions, nothing. That is and he uses the Easter Island statues as an example of that. So traditional cultures, he says, they limit the imagination of the young. So you have this magnificent phenomena of the long childhood, where the child is capable of taking in everything and then build something on it. But throughout most of the history, the ideal that has been set for children in traditional society is that of the adult, which is a fixed final stage to which a child should aspire to. Revering a child means revering curiosity, willingness to exercise imagination, coming up with new things, even when most of them are going to be wrong. Placing a value on that is placing a value on the child, and it is the same thing as placing a value on human. Because when you regard the current state of adults as the ideal, is the same as saying no progress. That is a static mindset. It actually is not human. It is holding an animal result, frozen with some products of human beings way in the past as the ideal. So that is the point. That is the first point in this I would like to make. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have any thoughts or comments about that. The idea is that in the holding child, holding curiosity as a value and encouraging that is not universal. It is there in the West, but it is not universal. So any thoughts about that? Dave followed by Joe. Dave.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think, is this where we would talk about educating everyone? Because I think Bronowski talks about the wealth coming up from the bottom of educating everyone, and that improves all society from the bottom up as opposed from the top down.
That's a different point. Maybe
Okay.
we'll get to that towards the end. Here
Okay,
we're
yeah.
just talking about how we look at the ideal. What is the ideal? What is the ideal human being? Is it a static or a dynamic? Joe followed by Vanessa.
My point is that we don't throw any children away. We educate the children of the poor as well as the rich. One of the famous CBS commentators' father was a ditch digger. Stephen Tubbs' father was an immigrant from Syria. That we never know where the promise is going to come to, so we educate everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cultural issue, Dave. I mean, the thing is, like, for in India, for example, for all its faults, education is truly valued. And that means that parents would go hungry to educate their child. And they would consider that, of course, that's what you do. I'm human. I am this child's dad. That's what I do. That value. Now, that is a very high value placed in the culture itself in a very deep way. So next up is Joe, Vanessa, and Madeline. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm just trying to think a lot here. Again, I don't want to come back, keep coming back to the same example, but I think that he made it seem as if this problem had been somewhat solved, right? That the child has been able to break free of traditional formats that the family would have, the role the family would have played in the past, and that's where he used where somebody like von Neumann would have been studying in rabbinical school versus actually performing, groundbreaking science. And I think that it's kind of, so it's hard for me to, I didn't know necessarily where he was coming. I think there's still a lot of growth that needs to happen in this particular area. As far as education, and we've talked about this quite a bit here at 52 Living Ideas, and the idea of play and the importance of play and how a child develops. But he did make it seem like the constraints of traditional societies, whether it be religious or whether it be the family in general, it was less constrictive than in the past. And that's been part of our evolution overall. That's the impression I got. I don't necessarily, I think our education system needs to evolve, but that is I think that would be way off topic if I'd be going down that direction. But anyway, but I will say this: having a very mechanistic educational system does limit an ability to be creative. So that if everything is done in a very strict way and it's very industrialized, that there is a limit as to the amount of creativity that comes out of that. So I guess there's that aspect of it that we still need to solve. But I don't know, I got the impression that he was saying, that a lot of these things in certain circumstances, we've moved past that. In certain traditional societies, maybe not. But anyway.
Right. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. I mean, there's so many issues here. I mean, one of the issues is that firstly, let me step back. Okay. Again, bringing in Jordan Peterson here. The Jordan Peterson's point is actually far deeper than what on this than Jacob Bronowski is making. He's saying that in order to grow, a human being needs to let things in them die and recreate themselves. And that is the ideal. That's what is trying to be captured by the resurrection of Christ, of saying that human being must be prepared to face the suffering, to die, let parts of them die, so that you can grow again. So that is basically the same thing as child, the way I see it, the idea of the child being free to take in everything that human beings have done and imagine something better and work towards it. So it's that impulse. So both of them are saying is that is something that is a kind of a root idea in the Western culture that is not there universally. That's one thing that they're saying. The second thing is that I would agree that actual implementation of that today is horrible. So for example, you look at Montessori system, right? It is the one that is focused on saying that a child is an independent being, and what you have to do is to give it a proper environment so it can thrive. And you watch it very carefully as you would watch a plant, and figure out what is needed and provide that when needed, but all the growth impetus is going to come from within. So that is a full expression of what it means to value a child. Now, a standard classroom is not of these 25 people sitting there where education is thrown at them, whether they get it or not, at whatever level. So that is definitely, there is that. And then there is the issue of the cultural values. How much do parents actually value the education of their children? That is a fundamental one. And then there is the education system of like the funding and stuff like that we're talking about. But all of these, like some of these go a little bit farther than what Bronowski is talking about. But those are all real issues, But I think the fundamental thing is the value placed on education. It is value placed on the child. And I think that is there in the West, but I don't think it has been not at all fully kind of realized. Let me see. Next up is Vanessa and Madeline. Vanessa.
Well, you definitely brought up what I was going to say, as far as we still have to acknowledge there were some in the US that with their mantras, children should be seen and not heard. And we talk about stifling imagination. And you also, I was going to bring up about the Montessori and how we do value the amount of research done in early childhood. And now not just childcare, but trying to get preschool in there, or universal pre-K, or just kindergarten. Like some people don't get the kindergarten, and just realizing and whether the importance, maybe not it's not universal, it doesn't apply for all, but the importance of unstructured play, like just maybe have the things out there and let the child find its own path, and maybe depending on maybe speaking afterwards. But I think definitely we do realize the importance of, in some cases, the politicians are thinking, well, wait a minute, if I want to lower
Vanessa,
crime,
let's not
maybe
go
we can,
too far. Let's not go too far from
but I'm
Ascent
just
of
saying,
Man.
but I'm just saying, in the case, but just realizing sometimes if we can prevent the harms or the evils later on, if we better prepare the child through education, imagination, and etc. We have a better foundation to work with.
Thank you. Next up is Madeline.
Okay, there we go. Shrikant, I liked your question about, or point about how here in the West, the ideal is somehow to be the child, whereas in basically every other culture through time, the ideal has been to be the adult. And I think there are enough people here who've been to the young meetup groups to be familiar with the archetype of the child. And the archetype of the child represents the new. What is new? What is inventive? What is creative? And in fact, here in the West, we've had hundreds of years, really many hundreds of years of staggering science and innovation in art and materials that really haven't happened before in the world. And on the other hand, every archetype kind of has its dark side. And one of the things a child does is it grabs at everything. That kid grabs and grabs, it wants stuff for itself, and when it's done with it, it throws it away. It just tosses it aside. It's not going to clean up. It's not worried about the neighbors. So I think that the ideal of the child, the archetype of the child, has been very beneficial in some ways, but in other ways, by valuing that without valuing, I'd say a more networked or connectivity, oral society, those values, the West has been doing a great deal of damage.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, let me just bring up the screen share to look at all the items that are there. So what we're going to go through is we're going to be talking about the utopian versus biological of what most of the utopias look like. Second is the role that printing played in the story. Then we're going to be talking about role of play. Then we're going to be talking about the difference between computers and humans. And then the idea of responsibility. Then we'll be talking about the warning of Bronowski to the West. And then we're going to end up with his final point about the personal commitment to one's own skills. So I want to start off with the utopia. That's a minor point, so I'll make it very quickly. Most of the utopias that people have thought of usually are static. They always hold that you do something and you reach a certain point and that's it. So regarding child as an ideal is very different, or even the biological ideal is very different from that. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly mention that. And let's go to the next point, and that is what printing did. Okay, printing is huge because it suddenly makes everything accessible, like all of the heritage. Before printing, books were very hard to come by. The literacy rate was probably, I don't know the exact numbers, but less than 2% for sure. Something like that, at most 5%, I'm sure much less than that. And even with that, the number of books that you had access to was very, very small. And that was all within kind of monasteries and stuff like that. So it's very limited. So printing dramatically expands that. So that's a huge, huge step forward for humanity, where most people can read and write. It took, of course, centuries to get there after printing, but that process got started. So printing, again, this is coming back to kind of McLuhan and people like that. So printing is a huge step forward. The next one I want to kind of quickly touch upon is the role of play. I think we've talked a little bit about that already. Now, the interesting thing that I'm finding is that whenever I start talking about it, Jordan Peterson's points and Bronowski's points are going together. And in many ways, the Jordan Peterson's points are actually very, very powerful. So the point about difference between computer and the brain, the point that Bronowski is making is that human beings need a system of values. The way in which Jordan Peterson makes this point is he says that there is a system that we need to act. So you can look at world as two things. You can look at world as a place of things or a place for action. And he's making the point that world as place for action comes first, because we are living beings. We're trying to live. Things, you figure out things about things in order to do that. So things like values, stories, or something, values come first. And grasping of that, you can never really, if you become more advanced in understanding of the world, but you do not develop values which are equal to that, that's a recipe for disaster. That's the warning that he's putting forth, which is a huge point. He talks about that you have to take the responsibility for the integrity of who you are, especially as an ethical being. Okay, again, this point is very similar to what Jordan Peterson is making, is that ethics is not an optional thing. It is not something that comes later. It actually comes before cognition. So living is fundamental, and you reason and figure out what the world is in order to live. So again, both these people in their own way are making the same point. So I want to pause a little here to see if you have any thoughts about that. So you're kind of, the point is that, science by itself is not self-sustaining. You need values. You need values. So that's the point. What is the relationship between values and science? Anybody? Joe.
Well, I guess in a way, the values protect the science. Mm-hmm. and ensure the science. And he talks about how essentially, again, not to keep coming back to the point that von Neumann was unable to to finish a lot of his work because he lost some of his values and was co-opted by essentially institutions that were more interested in other things. You contrast this with somebody like Sir Thomas More that was willing to die because of his values and for whatever it was. So that this is something, and I don't put those two. I don't think that that's a good way of illustrating somebody that's willing to defend values, because one was he was defending a religious value versus actually defending like kind of a scientific value. But he did talk about them, that it was intellectual democracy to a certain degree that was being defended. And I think about that in those terms. And yes, in order for things not to be hijacked by institutions, whether they be religious institutions or governmental institutions, values need to protect the integrity of the science and in order to make progress. And that's the warning that I think that he was giving us, that essentially that we can that we're at a point where these institutions may use these things for not virtuous acts, if that's anyway.
Excellent. So I want to make two last points, and then I want to open it up for general questions. First point is his warning to the West. I mean, he is deeply disturbed. This is in late 70s. He's saying that West is going through a period of subjectivism. I will call it subjectivism. He's saying ESP or just basically, or not being able to distinguish human beings from animals, mostly kind of emotionalism. And I think that's absolutely true. There is a subjectivist, subjectivist streak in the West. And he's saying that is against science, that is against putting things together, that is against ethics, that is, so that's the big warning. And he's saying, look, if West does not do it, then some other culture will do it. Just like Rome, there was no guarantee that Rome would continue forever. West would also not, there is no guarantee. You have to do this on a continual basis. You have to reinvent yourself all the time, keeping your eye on the ball, in order to do this. So that was one. And then he culminates, and I want to close with that, and then we'll take kind of general comments. First from everybody who has watched the video. They can give their own kind of take on the whole video, or anything, not take on the whole video, but what did you get from it? What did you get from the video? That's going to be the question once we're done with this round. He ends with this story of the photographer who went up in the aircraft in Africa, and then the aircraft crashed. Somehow, fortunately managed to survive, and they were waiting for the second aircraft to come. So Bronowski goes to him and says that, if you don't want to go up there to take pictures, I understand. But he says, no, I will do it. I have to do it. I'll be scared, but I will do it. And Bronowski's conclusion is that it is the personal commitment to your own skills that is the root of Ascent of Man. I think we need to combine it in this example itself, is that it is necessary to face the unknown, to face your fears, and to stretch in order to do this. So you need your commitment to skill in face of uncertainty and unknowns in order to go to the next level, to create something new. That's the point that Jordan Peterson makes, that you have to be willing to face the negative in you, around you, in order to go to the next level. And that point is the same point. The point that he ends up on is the same point as valuing the child, because child does exactly the same thing, takes in everything, and has an imagination to go beyond that. Even when it fails, it will keep trying to do that. And that to me is what he's saying. So now I'm going to open it up for kind of general comments on what you got from the video. So it'll be Judith followed by Dave. Judith.
Well, what I was thinking about what you were just saying actually is that what's kind of different or more different now than when Bronowski made this documentary is that really it's relatively recent that man has been able to use science in a way that can be destructive in a pretty global or dramatic way. And so now it's more important than ever that we have other aspects of our culture to, well, I guess that's the ethics you were talking about, but there are other things besides the science now that have to put checks on it like never before. Whereas before, people could experiment and do things, and if they didn't work out, they didn't have such a dramatic effect. And some of the things we do now have long range effects that we don't even understand. So that's something I see a little different now than ever before.
Thank you, Judith. Next up is Dave, followed by Mike. Dave.
There's the book. And to show you, it was 50 years ago, the price was $7.95. But I have to encourage all of you to watch the whole series. And I don't know if we can incorporate it into our meetups or not. But I want to mention two things from the first episode, because one in particular, answering Madeline's question about reaction to World War II. But the first is he starts in the plains of Africa, and that's where the plane crash was, holding up a skull of our ancestor and telling his story that he was a theoretical mathematician working, and someone brought him a prehistoric skull with a tooth and asked him to do some sort of measurement on a tooth. I don't know if, the size of it, or estimate, how old the child would have been or whatever. And he was struck so much, he changed his career from theoretical mathematics. He says biology, and I think now we would say it's anthropology. But the other thing in the first episode, he's a Polish Jew. Now, he was not there in the Holocaust, but he had relatives that were lost. His family got to Britain by 1920. But he is, and I like you talked about Jordan Peterson. To me, I see them very similarly, where Jordan Peterson is talking on a stage to an audience. Jacob Bronowski is in the field, on location. But in this case, he's at Auschwitz, standing at the banks of this pond. And he said, when his relatives were put in the furnace, their ashes were thrown into the pond. And he reached down and picked up a handful of mud. Those were his ancestors. It was just so wonderful. But as I said, you have to watch the whole thing. He's such a marvelous guy. He speaks slowly, with intensity, with passion, because it's obviously he loves this stuff. But it's just, to me, it's the comprehensivity. He's just covering the whole gamut of mankind, all of our knowledge. And this was just such a wonderful documentary. But I could say for another half hour, but thanks, Shrikant.
Thank you. Next up is Mike, followed by Maritza. Mike.
Well, seconding and expand what my friend Dave just said, and what Madeline said about World War II, he also grew up in the ashes of World War I. And Poland wasn't really a country during World War I. It was part of the contested battlefield. And that's how, and so he went to, his family went to Germany with latent anti-Semitism, and then came to England with latent anti-Semitism, not knowing a word of English. And a concept which we have, and we're going through in our country, the immigration, a stranger in a strange land. He was a stranger in a strange land most of his life, most of his formative life. And whatever doesn't kill you either makes you stronger or makes you weaker. And he came out stronger. He came out, as Dave said, the reason why he got tied up with Johnny von Neumann is that during World War II, he was like Robert McNamara and Russell Ackoff, was in Operation Research, working on queuing theory and bombing patterns. And that's what moved him from theoretical mathematics to theoretical physics, and eventually to biology, and eventually to bioethics. He ended up being as a bombing strategy expert and damage estimator. They sent him to Nagasaki and Hiroshima to follow that damage. His comment was, when we built the UN, we ought to build it in Nagasaki and not rebuild Nagasaki so that everybody from the world came over would see that devastation. So he had he got formed by both a good education system, good genes that made him that terrorized him into becoming a master of everything he touched, including being the including putting together this 13 series. Like John von Neumann and others, he talks English without a trace of accent. Uh, he was bullied and ridiculed by both the students and professors when he came to England because of his Polish accent and his limited vocabulary. So whatever doesn't make you whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger or weaker. And I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is Maritza, followed by Joe. Maritza.
I love what Dave said about how Bronowski just ties so many different things together, because I also found that to be true. And I watched, this last episode that you provided for us, and I was very sad. I was like, why would he give us the last one? I need more. I need the rest of it. So because unlike you, I don't entirely enjoy reading the last page first. However, in a nod to you, I went ahead and I skimmed through several of his works that I could find. And one that I found really fascinating was 1956. He wrote something called Science and Human Values. And there's a paragraph here about 2/3 of the way down that I feel just so beautifully encapsulates the question of values and how they tie into this concept of the ascent of man, because he's explaining how they're so correlated as to be inseparable. And he does it by talking about how we often, it's the habit. We have this habit of testing and correcting. And this habit is what ultimately becomes our habit of truth. And that there is what forms the core values that we just move forward. And he explains how science has it wrong, where we were thinking that science was this very, super objective path of knowledge and facts only. But it's like, that's not a lie, but it's impossible to have it without the truth and the your habit of truth following you. And so if you'll indulge me just a little bit, I'm gonna because it talks about poetry, I'm gonna just read this one thing real fast. The habit of testing and correcting the concept by its consequences in experience has been the spring within the movement of our civilization ever since. In science and in art and in self-knowledge, we explore and move constantly by turning to the world of sense to ask, is this so? This is the habit of truth, always minute, yet always urgent, which for 400 years has entered every action of ours and has made our society and the value it sets on man as surely as it has made the linotype machine and the scout knife and King Lear and the origin of species and Leonardo's Lady with the Ermine. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you. That was great. I mean, I have many books by him. I recommend him very strongly because he not only has a great base in science, and he's like he's a very original thinker. But the thing that really sets him apart is that he understands the humanities and art at a level which is unusual for a scientist. So he's able to follow things. And he's actually, I mean, to me, he's like a character out of 19th century in terms of how his mind works. He's far more systematic and far more comprehensive than most people in the 20th century. So there was, so he's amazing. So I would recommend reading his book, his several books. I would get Ascent of Man both in the printed version and the series, and you can watch. I think it's just incredible series. So I would recommend it very highly. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, what I taken away from this particular, I have not seen the series, but I think it provides a framework for analyzing a lot of the other thinkers that we've actually had on 52 Living Ideas and in general. Specifically, I think there's a lot to do with, Walter Ong or Marshall McLuhan and Merlin Donald. Yeah, I think all three of them can be incorporated into the types. And what he's doing is he puts it in a story format and a very logical way of progressing of how we should be thinking about some of these things. I also see a lot of parallels to what you had already, we alluded to a lot with Jordan Peterson. But I see it as a story of evolution. And this provides a lot of starting points to do a lot more research that essentially that like Maritza was just talking about. You can start to extract very important things like the development of our, the use of our thumbs and how this related to essentially the evolution of what the printing press means, what the what role playing means. You can see part of Piaget in this. So I see this as it's a very good way to lay the foundation for a lot of other research that we can relate it to. But that's what I took from it is, again, I've only seen the first episode or last episode, I guess. And so, I mean, from that, he's an incredible storyteller that can incorporate both the humanities and the science. So I'm excited about it as well. Hopefully we can squeeze it in.
Let me figure it out the way to do it. I mean, because I always do a pilot. So this is like a pilot to see whether it would work or not. I'm leaning towards doing something on this. It's how many of you would like to do this? Because this is actually very good. It's like, go ahead and type a exclamation mark, not exclamation, something. Yes or no. Would you be interested in seeing a series on this? So you got one yes from Joe. Dave, you said no? No, so just kidding. Sorry. No.
Yeah.
Okay. Brian, Maritza. Okay, so there is quite a few people. And okay. Madeline, no. What? Okay, anyway. All right. So
I would like to hear why.
Madeline, do you want to explain why no?
Well, just I feel that this is similar material to Merlin Donald, but in a different format.
No, it's very different. It is extremely different. What it is that it's actually, if you look at the whole series, it is really history of the development of crucial concepts of science. That's what most of it is about. So it is about, kind of basics of physics, basics of chemistry, basics of biology. So it's really a science, science work.
Okay, I'll give it a provisional no then.
Okay, sure. But so it looks like there is quite a bit of interest. So let me see how to do it, because it has to be done in a very exciting way. You know what? I think this is a good idea. So I'm encouraged by all the comments, and because for programming, I like to do things where saying, okay, and this will be a significant piece of the whole programming. because if I want to do it, I have to do it on a weekly basis. The thing that is unique, the thing that it adds to the 52 Living Ideas program is that it adds science. It adds science in, that's really what it does. It's like a science, and the scientific method is what people are going to really walk away with. That's what people will get from it. So wonderful, wonderful. All right, so thank you very much, everybody. Let me figure out. There are only so many days of the week, so I will have to figure out something, and we'll take it from there. There is another series I want to do, which is like the core works of the Western thought, Western philosophy, or Western thought, really. So that's another series. We've just started the series on Nietzsche. We have started the series on flow. So I will have to see where to put this. But let me work on it, and let me see what I can do. All right. So thank you very much. See you folks soon. Bye.